In 2021, hate crimes rose to the highest level since the government began tracking them 3 decades ago.
White supremacy seeks to maintain control. It often seeks to try to pit different racial minorities against one another.
The problem of domestic terrorism has been metastasizing across the country for a long time now, and it's not going away anytime soon.
Whether it's the lone actor, the Al-Qaeda ISIS-inspired, Shia-inspired, conspiracy theory-driven, anti-government extremist, or REMV, all of them have been galvanized and energized by what happened on October 7th.
Experts say violent extremists are using memes to fuel radicalization.
We need to make sure that what's reflected back to us in algorithms is something that's better than we are. You know that prejudice exists. You know that it exists online. And so you should be really worried if this is being hard-coded into your RAI.
Okay, hi everybody, how you doing? I'm Kara Swisher. It's great to be back here at the Washington Post, as it always is. Those know I started my career off here, so it's always a pleasure to be back here. I delivered mail for, not Jeff Bezos, thank God. Yeah. I'm trying really hard not to say something about that photo. I'm trying really hard, so I'm going to control myself. Anyway, good morning. I'm Kara Swisher, co-host of the Pivot podcast and also On with Kara Swisher. I'm joined on stage now by Rebecca Weiner. She's Deputy Commissioner of Counterterrorism Bureau at the New York Police Department. It's a huge job. Yasmin Green, CEO of Jigsaw, which is started by Google many, many years ago, and Sherrilyn Ifill, former president of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and is now a Harvard law professor. So we have a lot to talk about. This is an area I have written about for decades, about the increasing hate, anti-Semitism, homophobia all over. Yeah. Largely, I've focused on online and the rise of it, but we are back again with the current conflict in the Mideast. And you know, I'm sure some of you have read about it in the Post and elsewhere about the rise, global rise in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia since October 7th and the war between Israel and Hamas. Let's start with you, Commissioner Weiner. What have you seen in New York City over the past month, besides protests, which are certainly everywhere? Yeah. And what have you done to deal with the increase? You're always dealing with these various and sundry issues.
For sure. First of all, thank you so much for having us. It's a great honor to be here. And, you know, this is something that we contend with all the time, not just in the last 5 weeks, but the last 5 weeks have presented a real challenge. And one of the short clips that you all played in your video makes the point that this has really been sort of unifying in a way to the broad swath of our threat environment, and energized both our Al-Qaeda and ISIS supporters, our racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists. And when we were first conceptualizing this panel, the focus was going to be on that element of the threat spectrum. Of course, now we're contending with the war in Israel and Gaza and its aftermath. And you know, we're going to have a big rally here in D.C. later on this afternoon. So a lot of emotion, a lot of tension, and tensions have been rising across the world, including in New York City. Emotions are strong, and the goal has been, how can we allow people to channel those emotions and those sentiments in ways that are nonviolent on our streets? So we've had tens of thousands of people out over the last 5 weeks protesting across the spectrum, and our goal as a department and as a city has been to allow them to do that, and for the most part, things have remained peaceful. It's hard as a conflict like this, which is so protracted, and we're going to be, I imagine, spending some time talking about the digital landscape and how that is inflecting and infecting our threat environment. So as the conflict is protracted and as people are consuming all of the horrific imagery that's come out of the last 5 weeks, that's going to play out physically on the streets. So it's a big task for us as a department. It's a big task for us as a city. And every day, our officers, our men and women are out there making sure that we're keeping the city safe.
So when you use the word threat assessment or threat landscape, where would it be right now? Because you have a constant, I mean, from just regular parades and events and everything else, there were the Trump trials where everyone thought there was going to be some violence then, and then this. Yep. What do you think the threat landscape right now is?
It is very heightened, and the FBI director has been very forward-leaning in talking about this, NCTC director across the intel community and law enforcement across the country. It's very heightened, and to me, we go back to other moments, and as a city, we've confronted a heightened threat environment. Often over the last 2 decades. This one is likened in certain ways to 2014 in terms of the international terrorism threat environment, which was, of course, when ISIS declared its caliphate and inspired a lot of what we call homegrown violent extremists across Western countries to take action, a lone actor kind of threat, which I think a lot of people think about when we think about the lone actor threat. But this is also energizing people outside of that context, outside of the lone actors, and there is a certain element of coordinated group activity to think about, and that's a different threat, but it still can create public safety issues for us as a department. So we really have to walk and chew gum at the same time, and we're giant and we're used to dealing with this, but it is requiring a lot of our folks.
So Yasmin, the war obviously is being fought online, and this particular war is an information war in terms of imagery, in terms of misinformation, and not just misinformation, but real things. People actually saying real things that are quite. I was just talking to Sherrilyn backstage about every time Elon Musk retweets something or makes a comment, it creates even more. Like it's real stuff and it's fake stuff at the same time, all mixed in together. Talk a little bit about Hamas has wielded social media to its advantage and how the strategy is different than other terrorist organizations, because it isn't. There is a playbook to these things that I've watched over the years, whether it's election deniers or whatever. There's a certain up and down the spectrum.
Yeah, so I think the paradigm-shifting terrorist organization with regards to using the internet was the Islamic State, who just kind of took over the major social media platforms and were really able to recruit in a really sophisticated way. And just one example of this that really crystallized it for me was that when we were reviewing the languages that the Islamic State made marketing material in, they weren't just English and Arabic. They were like, German, Russian, Turkish, Kurdish, Chinese. But they even had a marketing video in sign language. So that was an organization that was taking the time and care to make sure that their message reached the deaf and hard of hearing. Nothing compares to that. In my mind, when I think about I don't think about people who had Super Bowl ads. I don't think about Think Different, the Apple campaign. When I think about marketing geniuses, to me that's ISIS. They had their own, Dabiq, they had their own online magazine, they had their own news outlets, they had music videos, basically. So they were really in a league of their own.
It's also inexpensive, right? It's an inexpensive way to do this.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about the Russians, they lost the Cold War, but have won, in many ways, the information war, because it's inexpensive and they're using the landscape that we created in the United States.
Right. There's some asymmetry there too, and it's cheaper for sure. What Hamas has done, they have a much less broad and imposing footprint online. They're not on the major social media platforms, with the exception of Twitter X, that they have had some visibility on. They do have a couple of news outlets, but that are online, but they're not quite as compelling or sought out as ISIS's ones were. But they have these Telegram channels that are, the founder of Telegram has been very explicit in wanting to give Hamas a megaphone, which is interesting to think that not all major apps and platforms have the same philosophy about moderation. And what Hamas has done really effectively, I think, was take something that ISIS did experiment with, which was live streams, but really the lone shooter, kind of the violent white supremacists, you know, the Christchurch shooter was the one that really kind of, I feel like, calcified this as the formula, was like, there's gonna be a live stream component, which means you go into combat with basically a little camera on your, you know, weapon, and you capture it, and you plan in advance to post that online and have it proliferate.
And proliferation is part of it. You don't have to have a big thing if proliferation works. And in terms of Christchurch, which was one of the first times. Let me ask you very quickly, what are the platforms doing it about it now? They've been cutting rather significantly in their moderation. They've given up. I don't know what else to say. They seem to have given up in a lot of ways. What has been their response? Because it seems like it's done. They've decided just to let it be.
Your impression is that the major platforms are allowing Hamas content?
No, I think they're not. They haven't. Whatever the content happens to be, whether it's, again, election denial, this is something that happens over and over again. They're trying to pull it down, but don't have a lot of purchase to do so, given the proliferation.
Well, okay, I suppose that's a bigger question about maybe how big tech is doing on moderation. Specifically on Hamas, I'll say that so the two archetypes of terrorism that have informed the way that the platforms prepare to respond to terrorism were the lone shooter, you know, which is typically it's like a burst of activity. There's a live stream, there's a manifesto. By the end of the day, the shooter's not even around anymore, or as in the shooter himself didn't survive, or they've been apprehended. So it's like a very short burst, and then it's done. You know, and they can begin the cleanup. And actually, the last shooter, I think the video was up for 2 minutes on Twitch or something really remarkable. So I think they are figuring out how to respond to that one. And then the other archetype is the ISIS, which really has been a formative experience for a lot of these trust and safety machinery. And one of the things, although ISIS seemed so formidable and terrifying at the time, one of the things that was helpful about the nature of the ISIS threat was that their branding was so good. You know, they always showed up on brand. They had their logos, they had their uniforms, they had their mantras, so the way that scale detection works on the social media platforms is that they train these algorithms based on showing them a lot of examples. They do pattern detection. So once they see so many examples, then they can go after something that they've never seen before, and they're like, oh, I think that's ISIS, even though I've never seen that video before, because I've seen so many examples of ISIS. Hamas do not have their shit together as much, so their stuff doesn't look as aesthetically, aligned. Mm-hmm. So I think that's one of the challenges in going after ISIS Hamas stuff proactively.
But assessing their performance so far is same old, which is to say less than good.
For the tech platforms?
I think they suck. Okay. You want my opinion? I don't think they care. I think that's more to the point. It's expensive and difficult. Sherrilyn, the uptick in Islamophobia and antisemitism is part of the larger consistent trend, which has been goosed by online media for sure. According to the FBI, hate crimes have been on the rise since 2004. Those reported numbers are likely a fraction of the actual number. What do you make of the rise, and what are the conditions in America that enable it? How do you put that together?
Yeah, thank you. I think we do have to put this in the context of the ecosystem, which is to say that online hate doesn't exist separately, and the rise in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia is part of a larger rise in hate crimes, as you described, since 2004, but also a spike since 2017. And I think if we are not careful, we will think that we're talking about something isolated that you can put a circle around, as opposed to a transformation that has happened across the board. I can remember in 2017, in 6 months, a white supremacist left Baltimore determined to go to Manhattan and kill a black man, and he came with a sword and killed a black man on a street in Midtown. Shortly thereafter, a black man who was a member of the ROTC, a student at Bowie State College, was standing at a bus stop to go to a party at the University of Maryland and was stabbed by a white supremacist. And then shortly thereafter, 3 men were attacked, 2 were killed on a light rail in Portland after they tried to stop an Islamophobic attack against a woman. I remember this because I wrote to Jeff Sessions, the then Attorney General, to say, something is happening and we need to hear from the Justice Department. And I also talked about the ways in which the president, then President Trump, was loosening the reins on things that create a climate for the rise in hate crimes, which is that there are norms that we have established and developed over decades that are largely what manages our conduct and even our thinking, right? What is socially acceptable and not socially acceptable. Right now, many of you have negotiated, the edge of the seat between you. You're not fighting with each other.
Not
There's
yet.
just a norm about how you manage it. You don't have to talk, right? There are things that we have established. And some of those things, hard fought through the civil rights movement, were about race and racism, were about gender bias after the women's movement. And to have someone at the top of the chain, that is the president, saying, you don't need that anymore, right? You don't have to police what you say. You can be free. In fact, it's liberating. It's fantastic to say whatever you want. Knock them out, drag them out of here. All the way in which he appealed to the headiness of not having to abide by norms creates a climate in which people feel loosed from the things that might make them move away from a particular site, or not stay on it, or not look at it, or not behave in certain ways, or read certain things. And so we have to recognize that when we're talking about technology, it is always being pushed by the real, what I call the real world, right? It is always being pushed by that. And it is a feature of this country that we have a history that is real, a history of white supremacist ideology that we will always have to battle. We will not end it, but we're always battling it, and we're always seeking to contain it. But it takes work to contain it. And it cannot be contained if you have the leader of the country saying it doesn't need to be contained. They're very good people on both sides, right? So I think that understanding the political dimension to this is critically important.
And then it becomes, what I've noticed is that offline behavior then got loose, which created online behavior, which then shoved itself back.
It's a loop. It's a loop. That's why I'm saying it's important to understand that ecosystem.
So
we're talking
now.
now.
Right now?
Say again?
Has that changed, or is it, that's it?
I think
done.
that we have to, this is the part that is depressing, but I think we have to recognize, is that having that leadership for 4 years broke something in us. You don't just snap back because you elected somebody else. Something was loosed, and it's hard to get it back. I also think we have to recognize that there is, and this is going to sound mushy, but I'm sure I'm right, a level of trauma that comes out of the fact that we have been through the coronavirus. I think there is a calcification that happens when 1 million Americans are lost in 3 years, and we have no kind of national cohesive manner of thinking about the grief of that. After 9/11, we grieved. Every 9/11, the bells still ring, and we all still do something, and we remember where we were. And that was for 3,000 people.
Now
We've lost
move on
1 million, and we
next.
just keep it moving. And we should not believe that calcification of the spirit does not have an effect on what happens when we see certain things or hear certain things.
Which has to do with the speed at which we get it. You're 100% right.
Karen, can I just give you an example that goes to the online, which is your point earlier? The Nashville shooting, the mass shooting at the Covenant School. We had an agreement. When I say we, I mean just in this country, and you know this, that manifestos would not be posted. We learned from Christchurch that shooters follow one another, that they, take up the manifestos.
Yeah, fan base.
Yes, but you'll notice that Elon on X decided that this was a free speech issue, right? And so there's a whole dialogue in which he has now positioned the idea of releasing the manifesto, which has been released on X, that's a free speech issue, and other platforms are censoring.
Right.
That was a norm that was created among tech leaders to try and stave away something that would harm us all. And someone just released it, but he will still be invited into the finest parties and into Congress without having to account for having broken a norm that you all established.
Well, I'm trying my best, but
Keep
it's
going.
not working. Backstage, Sherrilyn went, Elon, just like that. And I was like, yeah, well, welcome to the party. It's been going on for decades. Commissioner Weiner, when you talk about these hate crimes, you mentioned lone wolves and organized hate groups. I think they're interconnected now in a way that is not as well understood. Let's talk about the domestic terror hate group threat landscape.
So everything is interconnected in ways that we don't really actually understand, and that's because we are all spending so much time. I love that you are distinguishing real life from digital life, and I'm somebody who tends to do the same thing, but I think for younger folks, they are one and the same. They are indistinguishable from one another, and that creates psychological repercussions. It creates democratic norm repercussions. It certainly creates public safety repercussions for all of us. This environment is quite complicated. It is true that there are organized groups. It is true that there are lone actors. It is true that organizations seek to replicate the strength of each other through behavior like live streaming and manifestos, and the live streaming trend, which is now kind of deeply associated with the racially and ethically motivated extremism world, was very much a hallmark of ISIS, actually predated ISIS. So there's a lot of learning behavior that is occurring.
Best practices.
Best practices, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I think what's problematic for all of us who are trying to understand in order to anticipate and prevent violence is the ways in which ideological blurring is occurring. Individuals are drawn to one set of hate ideas, consume them for a while, and then migrate to others, which are completely mutually exclusive if you actually take it cognitively and intellectually seriously at face value. So the hate is driving the behavior, whether it's in the digital world or in the physical world. And I think for people who are looking for community, they might gravitate toward a group. A group can actually help prevent violence by being a safety valve, if really it's the companionship. But then there's a lot of people, in the Baltimore case of James Harris Jackson, who murdered a man in New York because he wanted to have more immediate impact for his terrorism crime, but also hate crime.
It is a community. I interviewed one of the parents of the kids killed in Connecticut, and the group of moms couldn't believe it happened, and therefore gravitated towards a group that they themselves didn't want their kids to. So it had to be fake. And he individually pulled them each out of it, which I can't believe he did that. But it's the idea of community. So talk about, Yasmin, the idea of connecting the dots, because it's not just one community, it's a lot. There's male supremacy and misogyny, there's violence against women, and then it's very closely linked to race. It's literally a panoply.
White supremacy.
They're all this. It is a playbook. When I say that, it's very common for them to have the same behaviors. Can you talk a little bit about the linkages? Because I don't think people understand the systemic nature of it and how it's welded together in an online group. It just happens to be the communication system, and then moves into the real world.
Yes, we at Jigsaw, we've been looking at extremism for a long time, which actually took us to look at conspiracy theories. Not every conspiracy theorist is an extremist, but every extremist is a conspiracy theorist. They're very important for actually creating othering, dehumanizing, creating urgency around kind of violent terrorist acts. And when we did our first study, so we do a lot of ethnographic studies, which is we bring people in and a very patient observational type of research where you spend time with people in their homes and you try to understand the human experience, and then you try to figure out what the technology touch points. But for our first study with conspiracy theorists, we said we wanted to have the full spectrum. So obviously the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. Hands up if you've ever heard of the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. Okay, so quite a few. So it's this, the theory that white societies are getting browner, which is true, but because a secret cabal of Jews is trying to dilute the white race. Every single manifesto, I think, white supremacist has mentioned that as a motivating belief. And then we had all the way to kind of moon landing hoax. And we want a whole spectrum of beliefs. So then we sat down with these conspiracy theorists, and there wasn't a single person who only believed one conspiracy theory. Why? Because conspiracy theories have this common architecture, which is there's the secret cabal, the hidden agenda, the cover story, and the proxies and affiliates. And once you subscribe to one, you're basically really open and receptive to any number of them.
Which is called, in the old days, propaganda. That's essentially what it is. And it has a resonance that's really fascinating. Many years ago, I tell this very funny story. I did an interview with Hillary Clinton, And my mom called me. She happens to be sort of right-wingy conspiracy, not quite, but down that avenue. At home a lot with Fox News, let's just say that level. And she started relating my interview to me through a conspiracy theory lens. And she's like, this is what she said. I said, no, she didn't. That was my interview. She didn't say that. She said, oh, she did. And I was like, no, she said it to me. And we had an argument. And I said, why don't you go listen to it? She went and listened to it. She's like, okay, she didn't say that. But the emails. Like, it moved to the next one. And it was like the next one and the next one, which is the...
So can I just say one quick thing about like the thing you were saying about that... So throughout time, conspiracism and I think extremism too, like have gone up during times of volatility and chaos.
Sure.
So like, you know, the Great Depression, you know, natural disasters. And there's this quote that I really like because I think it helps explain the human resonance of a lot of these like beliefs and disinformation narratives, is that conspiracy theorists are the last true believers in an ordered universe. Then you understand it as a coping mechanism, as a sense-making mechanism. We're pattern-seeking creatures. They have explanatory value. We'd rather believe that all the dots are connected and there's like a satanic cabal behind it all than to actually believe that COVID was just, you know, was just shitty luck.
Yeah. So Sherrilyn, obviously white supremacy, as you noted, has deep and persistent impact on our politics. How do you think the nature of American politics right now is responding and also driving the hate? You mentioned, obviously, Trump, but where are we right now?
Well, I think that many more people in this country than ever in my lifetime understand that there is systemic racism in this country. And more importantly, I hope understand that white supremacist ideology and racism is the stalking horse for so many other things that ail our democracy, and that our democracy will never be healthy until we confront it. In other words, if you're thinking that we just don't have to pay attention to it, and this is something that well-meaning liberals did, you know, the idea that it's somewhere down there in the South, and now the South has come for the whole country, right? That now we're seeing the Alabamification of the nation. So we actually have to address what is fundamentally an anti-democratic movement, because that's what it is. And we have to meet it. We have to go to meet it and deal with it, or it comes to consume the very democracy itself. It's not, you know, that's why I say to people, civil rights work is democracy work. It's not something that we're over here doing to get nice things for black people. It is at the core of building a healthy democracy. And that poison pill is poisoning us at the moment. So I think what is hopeful is that many more people see that. I think through Charlottesville. Remember when police killing unarmed black people was a conspiracy theory until many of you had to actually see it on videos to understand what we have been talking about for decades? So there are some things that have been revealed that I think help us understand that we cannot speak in just this lofty language about our country, but we have to deal with this.
We want to finish up. I want to talk very quickly, each of you, because we've only got a few seconds. What can be done to, and I want to end on you, Commissioner Weiner, because you have a personal element of that. But very quickly, what do you think needs to be done by the Biden administration or current politicians? Super quick.
Super quick. We have to be willing to talk about this honestly. We have to be zero tolerance. I met with several commissioners ago, you know, with the NYPD commissioner, and I thought, why don't we have, if you see something, say something for our domestic terrorism like we did for international terrorism? We have to be clear that it is policy in our country that this is unacceptable and that it is a threat to our country. Not that it's something about one group of people, but that when we have this intolerance in a country that is doing something no other country in the world has done, which is try to create a multiracial democracy premised on the ideas of justice and equality, that it is a danger to the very experiment itself.
Yasmin, technology, obviously. What can technology help in the battle against hate specifically?
Oh, just to compliment Sherrilyn taking us like historically and macro is just to say, actually, I think a lot of our technology interventions would be more effective if they were more human. I think actually a lot of the time when you see the tech platforms act, it's in a kind of like a scaled response to something that they have.
It's going less human, but go ahead. Keep going. It's moving less human.
I think we should reverse that.
More human, meaning?
In terms of insights, like, you know, I think like, for example, fact checking, I
think if you're like an engineer in Silicon Valley, like that sounds like a great idea. You know, people have like, they believe a false claim. Why don't we just give them the correction and they can update their false belief? Turns out that's not how it works. I think that's one of the most humbling things has been like how little fact-checking has done to help us with the misinformation challenge. And I think that's because we're not engaging with the human experience of believing in disinformation.
Perhaps because the people making it never felt unsafe a day in their lives. That's my theory of that. I'm going to end with you, Commissioner Weiner. There's a personal element to the discussion. As we close, can you talk a little bit about your grandfather, family, and how they inspired your work today? Your grandfather fled Nazi Germany. Most of his family didn't make it out. I think we have a photo. He worked on the atom bomb later. Can you just end on that, like how you look at that? Because this is not a new thing. Propaganda isn't new. Hate isn't new. No. It continues. It's just been turbocharged and will further be with current technologies, for example.
Absolutely. Yes, so my grandfather was a big source of inspiration to me. His name is Ulam. He was recruited to work on the Manhattan Project. My mother was the second baby born in Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project, and he stayed. And you know, he was pretty visionary in many ways, certainly intellectually and scientifically, but also the scientists involved in the Manhattan Project and the development of the hydrogen bomb also were involved in the development of the modern computer. And very early on, he had a conversation with a Hungarian physicist named John von Neumann, in which they were discussing what they referred to as a moment in time, described as some form of essential singularity, which is a term, the singularity that is pretty widespread in the tech community, in which human affairs as we know them will not continue due to the advent of technology. And I think if going back to the conversation of what's one thing that we can do to minimize hate, it is spend way less time on our electronic devices and way more time talking to each other.
I think on that note, I think you're 100%. Thank you very much.